Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is sponsored by INNUOS. INNUOS engineers innovative, artful, hi-fi products that deliver unexpected warmth and accuracy. Products that unleash the full potential of digital music playback. Going beyond simple ones and zeros, INNUOS products elevate music enjoyment by offering true audiophile performance from your digital music library or hi-fi streaming service. Find an INNUOS dealer near you to hear the difference. Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is brought to you by ZUAUDIO, waging a revolution in American hi-fi since 2000. ZU's responsive, highly efficient loudspeakers pack massive tone and shove to bring recorded music to life like never before. And ZU cables bring the same. Check out the Union 6 and Union 6 Supreme and get a first look at the upcoming Definition 6 at ZUAUDIO.com. That's ZUAUDIO.com. Clear in my throat. Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We are back in the saddle today and we have an interview with Justin Weber of ampsandsound, and the subject of today's podcast is what? It is 5 things to consider when buying a tube amplifier. We thought we would have Justin on to help us because he designs amplifiers and he is a hobbyist and a designer with what I would think is a great passion for the hobby. And also, if you have been following our previous podcast, his accolades with the part-time audiophile team are piling up. A couple of our writers got their hands on some of his gear and were mightily impressed. So that was another reason I really want to have him on. Not just that he has a great knowledge base for you guys, but also because he has either great taste or great ears. We'll find out. Justin, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing today, man?
I'm pretty good. Thanks so much.
So now that all the flattery is out of the way, your business card actually says Justin Weber, Chief Mensch. And if I looked on Google, it said, a mensch in Yiddish is a person of integrity, morality, dignity, with a sense of what is right and responsible. But a mensch is more than just the old Yiddish adage. It is relevant now across the world more than ever. To be a mensch is to be supportive, to be a friend, to be calm in troubled times. Can you just kick it off with why you may have chosen that particular phrase as the title on your business card?
Sure. So I was going to call the company Schmucks and Mensch. Whether I'm a schmuck or a mensch depends on the day, I suppose. So if you think like Steve Martin, he had a movie, I guess, The Schmuck, Idiot Accident, and The Good Person Audio Company. I come to audio with sort of a sense of wonder and exploration, and my company's not about making money per se, truly. It's actually an ego project, which is probably at some level worse than the chore of making money. Full-time, I'm a social worker, which means I adult at a really, really high level. I help people with severe mental health needs and drug abuse needs do better in their life and make better life choices. And I work in hospital and I help people in very difficult and troubled times. And my escape from those realities of providing care and being responsible and present and authentic and all of those responsible good things is to be wide-eyed and exploratory in my hobbyist life. And so I get to, for more than 25 years, build big ideas that make no sense and do it because I wanted to do it, because I could do it. And in so doing, I learned to do it better and better and better. A mensch generally is a responsible person who does good things. I'd like to think as a business owner, I am that. A hobbyist, I'm sort of a wide-eyed goofball who came into the hobby building really big speakers that had no consideration for size. amplifiers that had no consideration for weight or space, and that's kind of where things came from. And so the schmuck and mensch idea was sort of that duality of both of those points. The middle-age crisis escape for me of being a really responsible professional.
Now, a lot of your two-channel stuff has been causing a lot of splash, but I think you've left a pretty severe imprint on the headphone space as well. Is there any reason why you're either drawn or find yourself compelled to contribute to the headphone space in the amplifier section? Is it an easier build? Is it an easier sell? Or is it just something that's like another passion project of yours?
I would actually say it was sort of market demand. I was used to building high-efficiency speakers for personal use and cultivated a market that sought out my amplifiers for high-efficiency speakers. So they had to be really quiet, really dynamic, very, very low noise floor, things like that. And that 15 years ago, 20 years ago became smaller. That was less in vogue. And those same considerations that are really important for those kind of speaker systems are similar considerations for personal audio. The consumer of it is different, but the technical considerations are very similar. And so I transitioned my attention to personal audio. And really for 15 years I've focused on really developing personal audio as a primary driver of my company, because that's where there was new consumers, new attention, new development. There was a lot of R&D and a lot of experimentation with people. People went from wanting quiet amplifiers to really wide bandwidth amplifiers to both powerful and quiet and wide bandwidth amplifiers, and wanting it to be tubed and wanting it to have no feedback, and all of these sort of ideas that I find valuable. I found a home for in personal audio, so it became really important. And then sort of coming full circle, I've always still continued to build two-channel amplifiers. They were just really for me, because I've still always built big speakers for me personally. And I've always tried to include speaker taps in many of my headphone amps, because I always felt like how we consume music changes as our life, as the stage of our life changes. So when we go from earbuds to having more sophisticated headphones, to having bookshelf speakers, to having higher end speakers, to having headphones again because maybe we've had children, that these all are stages of life changes as an audiophile, and that you may want to have a system that can adapt with you rather than you having to reconstruct your system over and over again. And so since almost the beginning, many and many of my amplifiers have always had binding posts as well as headphone jacks. Well, I think in the personal audio sphere, many of the consumers now have matured through owning really high-end headphone systems and really understanding the importance of high-end sources. As so high-end DACs, they understand high-end source, high-end media, high-end headphones, but now are in a place in their life where they also want to share the music and really want more than a bookshelf system perhaps, and want a system for a living room. And so the two-channel space is broadening again to include a consumer that has grown with me. I'm reintroducing myself to the two-channel market because there's a person that has known me that I think is ready to see more that I can offer.
I really like your point about the life cycle and how it is kind of cyclical in nature at points for the audiophile, how you kind of could start with headphones and then progress to speakers. But when you have children, or especially during the pandemic, we kind of went back to headphones in some respect, right? We returned to the origins. Now, this particular subject you bring up is one of great debate within the audiophile community. I feel like it's been discussed quite a bit, but I want to ask your opinion on it too. Do you think that the headphone crowd will all become 2-channel people, half, a very small percentage? Or do you feel like 2-channel in itself, and I think this is the main concern for a lot of people, is a dying dinosaur that will eventually just be gone and will be left with Sonos and those type of things?
I think that so much of being an audiophile is far too narrowly defined, and because it's so narrowly defined, then it has to die. When I look at that there's all these different places that being an audiophile truly has grown into, the tent has widened and widened and widened. The fact that you can buy a Sonos and embed it in a wall, and embed 4 of them in a wall, is super cool, actually. That's really, really cool in my mind. And if I had an office that I could have done that with, I don't know that I might not have done that with, and put like Cat5 cables into all 4 of my Sonoses and put a subwoofer in it. Or being an audiophile is the enjoyment of music reproduction. It's not how I do it. It's the enjoyment of music. I'm always a big tent guy. And so if you ask me, is 2-channel dying? Maybe. Or maybe it's morphing. Is 2-channel democratizing to different formats that are not just 2 speakers? Yes. If it's always a zero-sum game, then that's the answer. But I don't think that that's really the answer. Like, if you look at like units of sale, how many Sonos-like speakers are sold? And does that equate to similar numbers of KEF LS50s that are sold? Passive LS50s that are sold? I don't know. But I mean, I think that you might find that that the pie is getting bigger and bigger. It's just looking different.
Certainly the growth of analog and turntables shows that we still have a love for the simplicity of things and an organic kind of touch and feel, right? So it's not that the love of music has diminished or the love of playback has diminished, but rather what form does it take? And when you look at convenience of Sonos and then the tactile response of analog, we still have like a need inside of us to have the full listening focused, right? Focused experience on listening, not a passive listening experience.
The Sonos analogy is so interesting because it's like, on one hand, can I stream all of my music happily and be content, right? And then do I want to have the tea ceremony effect of finding something special that's archived as a record, treating it as the special experience that it is, and listening to it in its entirety as the artist conceived it? Both of those ideas can like coexist. And I think that in large measure, that's really what modern listening has become. It's like I can listen to like 10 different tracks from 10 different artists from 10 different time periods and 10 different genres, or one album
right,
that is from one artist, from one genre, and they both will command just as much of my attention. I think that we should be less fearful of those ideas and be more supportive. Like they're both really interesting points.
I've heard it kind of paraphrased as, you kind of listen at scale, right, for the streaming services. And then when you have an album or you have an artist and you want to support that album, it's like voting. You say, okay, I'm going to go buy the record now. I'm going to go support the artist more directly because most people realize they get more money that way, right? And you cement your vote into this system where you say, I got the record now. I mean, obviously some people just shop records, and if you look at anything like what Taylor Swift's strategy has been lately, is she really pushes the record. I mean, the physical record in stores, because that's her audience. These young women.
Wait, I bought it. I'm not going to lie. Look, I've bought every version of it. Me and how many millions of other people did. I've streamed it, but I also bought it.
I can't tell if you're joking or not. Do you really own it, or are you just?
I can go get it for you. If you give me a second, I'll go.
No. That's not necessary.
I bought the thing that we play. That which I play more than X number of times, I'm going to purchase a concrete copy of.
Obviously, that's why she does it, because she makes money. But I still think that it's symbolic that her audience wants that experience still, and that it's not lost. It's not disappearing into the ether. There will always be a need, I think, in kind of like a human need for us to touch and feel and focus, right? And I think the worry for a while was that we were all just going to turn into like mindless drones that just listen to iPods and walk down the road with a blank look in our eye, right? But I don't think that's the case. I think there's a little more humanity left in the world.
I mean, to take a slightly more audiophile approach to the conversation, I bought the UHQR Miles Davis Kind of Blue album, right? Mm-hmm. $150 album. Mm-hmm. It sounds dramatically better. 100% better pressing. I also have bought $50 downloads of recent recent high resolution rips that are like DSD 256s. They sound dramatically better too. Mm-hmm. I recognize that like streaming is to CDs what high resolution downloads are to vinyl. And when I care about listening to it more deeply, I buy it. I think the fear about like 2-channel versus headphones comes down to you can approximate the ultra performance for less than 10 grand. You can approximate absolute pinnacle performance with a headphone rig that you can't do with a 2-channel rig for under 100 grand to get sort of commensurate levels of resolution.
Yeah.
A headphone DAC, whether it's mine or someone else's, maybe it's a $10,000 to $20,000 adventure. A headphone amp, $10,000 to $20,000 adventure, and a headphone is a $5,000 to $6,000 adventure. So you're into it for $26,000 stem to stern before cables. And then you have a MacBook Pro with an SSD drive for $1,000, $1,500 versus, what's a truly high resolution set of speakers going to cost you? Truly high resolution.
Right.
Not good sounding. Like I would tell you, like, I own romantic good sounding speakers. I do not own high resolution speakers. I mean, I know what I got. I mean, I can accept my limitations. There are differences.
I think you're really getting onto something interesting there, because I really didn't hear the resolution that I heard in headphones until I went to audio shows. And even then, I would still argue you got to have a really well-treated room to get the resolution without the room at all in the headphone, right? So there's no room, essentially, aside from the ear cup. So the room is the really tricky part, even if the resolution is there. Okay, right? Sure. I think the only time I started to hear what you're talking about is when I went to audio shows, and I started to hear extremely high-end systems where I'm like, okay, now we're getting there. We're getting somewhere where it's on level playing field. Now, I would hardly argue that the speaker feeling is much more natural, real, and to some I would maybe say pleasurable. If you can feel the bass a little bit, it's a little more tactile, the whole thing. So I'm not discounting 2-channel. I think it is a really fun listening, shareable experience. But when it comes to resolution straight up, the things I've heard through high-end headphones, I'm still amazed by the capabilities that they have. It's just crazy.
Maybe this is leaning into like a self-serving argument, but speakers win with imaging. They always will win with spatial cues. Always. There's very, very, very few headphones that could approximate the spatial cues necessary for imaging that speakers do. Headphones win for intimacy. They can bring you that sense of being very close to the microphone, to be part of the music. It's different. It's a different experience. And so, if you want to perceive into the music, maybe headphones are the right choice. But if you want to experience the music 15 rows back, speakers are always the better choice. But the question is, for dollars spent, where does someone see their value proposition? That's a consumer level choice, and one I can't always. I'm not going to adjudicate that for the person making that choice. It's for each person to decide for themselves. I will say though that two people can't listen to a single headphone. You can't have a glass of wine and some cheese and have one headphone strapped around two people's heads. Doesn't work.
It would be kind of hilarious if you tried, but I wouldn't want to stretch
I'm sure it's
out
been
the
tried,
arm.
but
Well, we used to share. I don't know if you've ever been in a pinch, but when I was a kid, we used to share wired in-ears, one on one and one on the other. And then there was a couple of devices that came out that would let you like split it, but they were a nightmare. Oh, these yeah, it was just terrible. But there's a community of headphone people, but the community itself seems to have a shared experience of solo, right? It's a little more, I think, diverse in the way people's opinions get formed. And I think that there's a lot of variance, too, based upon how people hear or how they perceive things with headphones. I know there's a lot of variance in speakers as well, but I find, I guess, less unanimous kind of consensus around a lot of things. But, that could just be my experience on the forums and whatnot.
Oh, I think that there's a lot of empiricism attempted empiricism overlaying with headphones, like the Harman curve question and frequency response and things like that. I build distortion producing devices. They just sound better. That is not a selling point for me always. I tend to want something that engages me and motivates me, not something that has to be ruler flat. But with headphones, there's very often a discussion of how precise and distortion-free and analytical is the device or stethoscope that I've purchased is. There's a lot of that goes on. And I think that that's sort of a distraction, unfortunately. Each community has its own nuances in communication.
Today's episode is brought to you by one of the originals in high-end audio, Purist Audio Design. Purist Audio Design is proud to announce their brand new Diamond Revision. It's brand new. Re-engineered from the ground up for improved audio quality, the Diamond Revision features the clarity of diamonds, with a sound as articulate, dimensional, deep, and delicate as those stunning stones. With the Diamond Edition, experience deep bass, more microdynamics, macrodynamics, and an extended top end. For over 35 years, Purist Audio Design has connected you to the music. They passionately make high-end, handcrafted audio cables designed specifically to the needs of your system. They list their specs, such as resistance and shield quality, and you can find them at PURISTAUDIODESIGN.com. Purist Audio Design is veteran-owned and available worldwide. Today's episode is brought to you by Expona 2023. America's largest high-fidelity audio show takes place April 14th, 15th, and 16th at the Renaissance Schaumburg Hotel and Convention Center near Chicago, Illinois. Plan a trip to the Windy City this spring and sample over 190 listening rooms of high-end audio equipment, and explore the latest in headphone hi-fi and Expona's Ear Gear Expo. Tickets are available now at AXPONAdotCOM. That's www.AXPONA.com. So, I think we're going to jump into the meat of the conversation here that we kind of introed with. 5 things to consider when buying a tube amplifier. Justin, how about this? Number 1, power needs. When it comes to power in an amplifier and someone's considering buying a tube amplifier, what do you feel is kind of the considerations and the most talked about really points when it comes to power needs and speakers?
I always tell people, pick your speaker first.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't picked your speaker, stop, like hard stop. Don't do anything else. Pick your speaker first. Almost always, you need vastly less power than you realize. That's a general idea. Now, this is coming from a guy that sells low-powered tube amps, but that's still, I've seen 1-watt power whole rooms and big rooms with moderately efficient speakers. So I'm coming from, that's my shared reality. But, what's a practical standard? 30 watts should do 99% of everything for everyone. And 15 watts should do 95% of everything for 99.9% of everyone. Like, let's use real world examples. I think that most audiophiles have small listening rooms. Like, if we say, like, there's two styles of audiophiles. You have a small listening room like I do, or you have a big, huge listening room. There's like only two camps, right? And so if you have a small bedroom listening room that's 10 by 10 or 11 by 11, you have a set of KEF LS50s. How much amplification do you need? 15 watts tubed will do you perfectly. 50 watts may sound better, maybe, but I think it's probably more of a product of it having a better output transformer and the bigger output transformer's core actually having a flatter frequency response and going lower.
Interesting. I like that. Yeah.
I don't know that it's a question of it producing more power, that you needing more power, as much as that the transformer that you got with the more powerful amplifier is actually a better transformer. So the KEF LS50 is like, what, 84 dB, right? And SPL is a logarithmic function, so 84 dB to get to, what, 86 dB takes, you have to double the power. Or to get to 87 dB, you have to double the power, right? So 1 watt becomes 2 watts to get to 87. To get to 91, it has to become 4 watts. To go from 91 to 94 has to become 8 watts, right? I mean, you're still under 10 watts for average listening. Even if you say then you double it for transient peaks. I mean, like, in a small room, we're not talking a lot of power, truthfully. But I think that a helpful thing to think about more than power is bigger transformers always sound better. They just do. They saturate less. They produce square waves better. They almost always have better frequency response. They go lower. They have lower distortion doing it. Bigger transformers always sound better. And typically, bigger transformers come with more powerful amplifiers. So if you can get a bigger an amplifier that produces less power but has bigger transformers, you might be just as happy. Interesting questions are like, what do I really need? I still contend that, like, a push-pull EL84 amp is a 12 to 15 watt amplifier. That's most people's perfect need for like a KEF LS50, and an EL84 sounds amazing doing it. A push-pull EL34 would be 25 watts to 35 watts. That's more than enough. A push-pull KT88 would be 50 to 60 watts. Again, more than enough. Anybody who says that a 120 or 150 and 100 watts is necessary for the KEF LS50 probably fried the voice coil first. I don't think that they're I don't think that they're actually hearing the power as much as they're hearing the better transformer or the better power supply first. It's not always a question of like I know that you're looking at the quotient of power, but to safely have that power rating, you have to have a power supply that is robust, and you have to have output transformers that can sustain that power at a given frequency response. And so my central argument is that you want a better output transformer no matter what. And so regardless of power, because I think that you truthfully, like, I've used an LS50 with, 5 watts happily in a 150 square foot room, but the transformer was a 30 watt core transformer, but I was only producing 5 watts. And everybody who heard it was just as happy too, and they would have thought that they were listening to a 20 watt amplifier, but they weren't.
So you mentioned a couple of different tube push-pull terms. What are the tube topologies that you like and use? And can you just give a brief explanation of why someone who wants to buy an amplifier would choose a different tube topology over another one? Because there's an immense amount of options in this field, but I think there's a lot of confusion about what's right for what given situation. How would one go about choosing one type over another?
So the two big questions are single-ended versus push-pull. Okay? So single-ended, Class A. Always on, 100% power all the time. Okay? The next one is push-pull, and it's half on, half off. They're switching on and off half the sine wave at any one time. And it has, generally you have an input tube and you have a phase inverter, and then you have two power tubes. And so they're only carrying half the power at any one time. And they produce double the power, sort of, as a given thought, you know? If you need more power, you need push-pull. Can you cuss in this, or can you not cuss on this podcast? Because I can't make this analogy without cussing.
Oh, no. Have at it. Whatever you like to do.
Okay. So single-ended amps are called cock teases. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's all the fucking sound you ever wanted. It's sweet as you ever fucking wanted it to be, but never enough of it.
Okay.
That's what they're known for. That's typically what people think. It's so beautiful. It's so perfect. It's just so lovely. But just a little more. Just a little more. If I could just two more watts more.
Yeah.
Push pull. Typically, you're like, that bass, it's so tight, it's so firm, oh my God, it's so fast, the transients, oh my God, that air, that space, but it's just not sweet. Why isn't it sweet like the single-ended is? The single-ended, it sings to my soul. And then with the single-ended, you're like, it sings to my soul, but I wish it had a little bit more on the top end, just a little bit more on the top end. Because the single-ended, you typically don't use feedback, because then you want it to sound natural, like Italian cooking. All the perfect ingredients, but no MSG, right? So it's got to be the perfect vine-ripened tomatoes, the perfect olive oil. Everything is as it is, and you accept it the way it comes, right? And so, you have this dense mid-range. And if the power supply is really good, you might have the bass is tight enough and it's proportionate just like you'd want. But the mid-range it's like that butter. It melts in my mouth. It's perfect. That voice is just as it should be. It floats, but the highs, I just wish the highs were just a little bit more there. Then you have the push-pull. The push-pull is like, it's fast, it's firm, it's present, it's live like electricity. But it's not as real as I want. Why can't you give me both? Can't you make a Franken baby? Can't we genetically modify things for both? I want both. Modify them. Genetically enhance things for me, please. And when we do, because we do try, I've tried. I have one success. I have one success with genetic modification. It's called the Bryce. The Bryce is a genetically modified animal. What many, many modern tube manufacturers do is they put in types of governor circuits to make more and more linear tube amplifiers, to make them sound more and more predictable. Because on one camp, you have people like me who's like, hey, I want a 1960s Ferrari. You break it, it's your fault. But I want that like 1960s analog flavor. I just, I want that topping bubblegum from 1980s. I want it analog, warts and all.
It was
and then you have the other.
It was so stiff, and it broke into like little hard pieces in your mouth. The gum,
right?
But that's gross, wasn't it?
But the sugar stayed forever.
It did. It was so like, the sugar was like, you could hear it crunching like when you bit into it.
Then you have the other side. It's like, I can make this a cyborg. I can plant a chip behind it, and you'll think it's a tube, but it's really not a tube anymore. It's a solid state amp with a tube in front of it. I can snuff the life out of this thing for you. It'll look like a tube amp. It'll bark like a tube amp, but it will not sound like a tube amp. And so they add circuits to homogenize the behavior of tube amps, and that is dispalatable to someone like me. And so I tend to tell people, accept it like it comes. It's not always going to be perfect, but it's going to have realism, life, and dynamics that you're going to want more. And if you don't, okay, then these are choices you make, and choose different. So, like what I did with the Bryce, which was a curious, interesting example of my own modifications, which were different than what other tube manufacturers do, is I took a power supply that would normally be used in a push-pull amplifier. So it has a bias supply, which is a way of clamping the voltages down. So it gave the Bryce, which is a single-ended amplifier, Class A, has really, really firm bass, like stupidly firm. Sounds like a push-pull amplifier firm bass. And I also gave it a little bit of feedback. And by doing that, I gave it a little bit of air and space up top. And I gave it really, really firm bass. And so everybody goes, it doesn't sound like a single-ended amp. No, it sounds like a genetically modified animal. It's like Monsanto. And I find that a more interesting idea because there's no integrated circuits, there's no op amps, there's no voltage regulators involved. It's all analog. Versus the other approach is like you put JFETs on the back end of things, you put integrated circuits on the back ends of things, you put things that were developed in 1990 from 1990 to 2010, and you put it on the back end of a tube. And yes, it makes a tube behave more predictably, but it also changes how the tube sounds. And we each choose differently. So back to the question, you can make a single-ended amp sometimes behave better by making the power supply better. Sometimes people do that also by adding voltage regulators to single-ended amps. I didn't like that idea. I just used the power supply that would have been used out of a push-pull amplifier. Still analog, just no regulators. And you could use feedback, which is used in push-pull amplifiers. Again, still an analog idea, just not used with any regulators. And that's how you make a single-ended amplifier sound a little bit more push-pullish. And with push-pull amplifiers, how do you get them to sound more organic? You typically would give them more voltage swing on the input, or you give them a softer power supply. So you might make them tube rectified, so someone could kind of change the power supply's behavior by which rectifier they're using. So they might have more voltage swing on the rectifier, like going from like a 5AR4 to a 5U4 will give more sag in this power supply, and that might change the sound. Or they might use an input tube that has a lot of voltage, and by doing that, it'll change the behavior of its sound a great deal. There's a few different ways to kind of change how it would sound without adding ICs to it. In general, though, from a topology standpoint, things I stay away from. I don't have a problem with amplifiers typically having feedback or no feedback. Feedback, most people wouldn't use feedback excessively unless there was something wrong with the amp. So if the feedback is kept to single digits, meaning under 9 or 9 and under, it's not a big deal. 9 dB or under is not a big deal. When it starts looking like 27 dB of feedback, that means there was a lot of the input signal is so significant, is so large that they could apply so much feedback already, right? That then you're like, wow, that's a curious circuit then, right? Maybe not in that circumstance, right? I don't like in single-ended amplifiers what's called parallel single-ended. So I don't like multiple power tubes on a single-ended amp strung together in parallel. to get more power out of it. Because you remember how I said they're cock teases and you want more power? Strapping on, if you've ever watched TV, there's this thing that they use on some women called cutlets, which they take a piece of rubber and they put it under the woman's bra and it pushes them up so they might seem bigger. It's like that. Don't make it real. It just, it's not a good idea. That's not the way to do things. I also don't really like the idea of running two-stage amplifiers. So like what some people will do is they take a really big power tube, like transmitter tube, 845, 211, and they'll do like a 12AX7 into a 300B. The 300B power tube becomes the driver for an 845. So now you've made this two-stage amplifier. So the 12AX7 is the driver into this power tube of the 300B. Now that's the first stage. Second stage is the 300B now drives the 845. A lot of Chinese amps that you might find on eBay were doing that for a while. Yeah, it'll get you the power. It'll get you like 25 watts Class A. It seems like a very complicated idea. Whereas if you see somebody who's running like a 12BH7 directly into an 845, or like two 12A U7s in a push-pull configuration into an 845 as a push-pull or a two input tubes into a single big power tube. That's an honest answer. I don't think that looking at a two-stage single-ended design is really a great idea, in my opinion. There's some complexities there it's a harder output transformer, it's a harder design, less widely recognized as a good idea. Probably not the best probably not the best path to choose. And then for like power tube, for push-pull configurations, I know lots of tube manufacturers choose multiple power tube designs for push-pull configurations as well. I am not a full-time designer. I've lent on the designs of very smart people who've come before me, who've done research and IP work for me. But I can tell you with a fairly broad understanding of design work that's come before me that there are significant compromises with that kind of approach, that it is a more linear, understandable amplifier in a traditional push-pull configuration with two power tubes. And if you can't get it done with two, you shouldn't be doing it. And considering that you can buy two 150s and can get up to 150 watts out of two 150s in a push-pull configuration, that should be more than enough for most people. And if it's not, then at that point, maybe considering a solid-state choice may be a better choice.
Now, you've talked a lot about kind of the sounds of things. I'm wondering, what is one of the things that people need to consider when buying a tube amplifier when it comes to the overall voicing? If a tube has like a unique color to it, also, you had mentioned this on several accounts, linearity, because it has been my experience that sometimes when you get a tube amplifier in and you're really breaking it down, it's not always as linear as it could be. I find some people bump up the bass. Sometimes these things happen a little more frequently than they do with solid state. Not that every solid state is perfect, but only that it seems to have a little bit more variance with the tubes. And part of the fun can be sometimes tube rolling for people, right, where they're going to experiment with different sounds. But from your perspective, when you're considering these different types of amplifiers, do you have a voicing preference? Or you already mentioned in some detail about in the power section about how certain tube types can change and certain designs can change with the voicing. But do a lot of tubes have a unique flavor to them, in your opinion? And how is that managed, or how can that like form fit into a speaker better than others?
Every amplifier has a primary impedance, or every output transformer has a primary impedance. Its primary impedance ratio directly affects the amount of distortion and power that amplifier is going to be producing. With a single-ended amplifier, as an example, if you took like a 300B and it had a primary impedance of 2.5 into a 300B tube versus 5K, you would expect almost twice the distortion and 30% more power. That's okay. That's like, these are things that you would normatively predict. And that changes what the harmonic composition of the sound is going to be. So it's not just the tube choice, but regarding the overall voicing. So when you are picking an amp, not every customer gets to know this, and I recognize that fact. But you kind of want to learn what the company is known for sonically, right? What's the company's sonic signature typically known as, and then also kind of overlay that with what tube choice or what tubes are typically that they use are typically known for sonically. And if you put those two together, I think you get sort of like a scattergram, or a Venn diagram between the two, that you should start to see what some truths may be. Audio research amps tend, regardless of circuit, right, tend to be very detail-rich amplifiers without excessive emphasis in any one frequency range, or maybe some slight lift in the higher frequencies. I would predict, not looking at the circuit itself, but I would predict that the transformers don't have excessive inductance, but that the transformers, now that I know that the company, that they're known for sort of even keel, fairly flat frequency response range, what are they choosing for tubes? They tend to not choose KT88s anymore, which tend to be sort of bottom heavy. They either are choosing 120s or 150s. 120s tended to be known to be a little bit bright at times, and 150s are kind of this sort of perfect middle ground between a really flat frequency response, right? And so if someone says, hey, I want something that's a really neutral choice, I would say an audio research amp is actually a really good choice for somebody who's saying, I want a really neutral voicing, right? And I would say that would pair really well with something like a Wilson, which is a really neutrally voiced speaker, or a Stenheim, which is a really neutrally voiced speaker, truthfully, right? The customer who wants that is wanting that detail and lack of tonal overlays. And so I look at the company's known sonic profile, and I look at the tube's known sonic profile, and I kind of go, that's the voicing I'm going to be expecting, right? Whereas like Macintosh very typically is known to be very bottom heavy, mid-range heavy, and they love KT88s, which lines up very well with what you'd expect to hear from KT88s. Not 6550s, but KT88s, and then the question of like, what do people typically think pairs well with Macintoshes? Well, lots of dealers would tell you that like B&Ws pair really, really well with Macintoshes. Now, I'll tell you that I think B&Ws can sound really, really bright, but on one hand, if you pair it with a Macintosh, it will tame some of its brightness, perhaps. But oh, by the way, B&Ws sound like they have absolutely subwoofer-like bass when paired with Macintoshes. There's a reason like the two go together. It's not a bad pairing. Like it actually makes sense. Like put the two, like a 702 and a 275 is not a bad idea. Like it makes sense. So I think that when you look at the company, kind of look at its long history, most companies don't play games with their voicing. They have a really known voicing profile. Right. I think we have a known voicing profile. Recognize that. There's nothing wrong with it. Know what they are. And then recognize what power tubes that they may be using or could use, and understand that that is going to so kind of going over the menu, right? So 6L6 the greatest American power tube that ever existed, is a mid-range centric tube. It is not bottom heavy. It is a mid-range tube. It does the mid-range like magic. You choose it for its mid-range. The best modern example of a 6L6 GC is a Tung Sol 6L6 GC STR. It's worth every nickel that you pay for it. They're not terribly expensive. If you buy a Macintosh 240, drop 4 of those into it, you have a reference sound that's mid-range centric. If you really want air and space, not my idea of a good time at all. If you want air and space, you might be an EL34 guy, right? If you're wanting spatial cues, EL34s tend to be that person's bailiwick. And that's great. Like, I understand it. But for someone who is more the KT88 6L6 guy, they're going to be like, it's too thin. Because for those spatial cues to exist, the mid-range must be slightly more suppressed. It's how harmonic structure is going to work. Dave McNair can give you a whole lesson plan on how that exists in much greater detail than I ever could.
There's only so much space.
EL84s are like the little engine that could. They almost give everything a little bit of everything, but never enough of it. A really good example of an EL84 amp, if I remember correctly, Manley makes a very good example of it with the Stingray.
Right.
VTL did for a long time. Right? And they're both great choices. And Manley gives a really good EL34 example too, right? With the Manta Ray, if I remember correctly as well. Conrad Johnson has done some EL84s in historically. I think they may have moved past that just because of power desires, but EL34s were a Conrad Johnson choice for a long time. If you like sort of a 6L6 mid-range, but you want a kick in the ass bass, that's called a KT88. Mm-hmm. If you want a hybrid between an EL34 and a KT88, it's called a KT77. Slightly better bass, but better highs and mids, better highs and harmonic texture, it's called a KT77. If you want a slightly less highs and mids and a little bit more mid-range, but still in the KT77 family, it's called a 6CA4, which is the American version of a KT77. It's actually structurally different, but it's the same tube. Yeah. Don't own a KT120. They're really big. They can sound shrill. They never typically, no one ever runs them hot enough, so they always sound a little cold and brittle unless you're running them hot enough. Everybody likes a KT150. KT150s are everybody's modern choice of a good power tube.
So we did an entire podcast just on the 300B, which you haven't mentioned yet. Where do you lie with the 300B?
So I built an amp that uses what's called a 6B4G, which is a 6-volt triode. And I used to really push that as being a better choice than the 300B because you can still get it in NOS form for like $100 to $120 each. So you can get like 1950s examples for like $150 to $200 each. So for like $400, you can tube this thing with like 1950s Kenrads. Classic wonder. So that's super cool. Like, that's amazing. Like, the fact that you can do that with NOS tubes is really cool. But when Western Electric started really issuing the 300Bs back, I had to revisit the idea of producing a 300B amp. Mm-hmm. And so the Agartha idea got revisited. And we brought back the Agartha and were able to like make improvements to the Agartha. And then we did basically took our Nautilus platform and converted it into what became the Red October, which was, all turret based, big transformers, big chassis, all point to point. I believed in it enough to do it at the really high level, at the right way, because there was a real option that wasn't a unreliable option. Now, I think like Elarogs are really good choices. I think Takasukis are really good choices. I think China is a wonderful manufacturing partner for many, many things. I think China as a tube manufacturer has yet to really define themselves in the market as a reliable choice. Because we don't have reliable partnerships with China. So if you buy a Chinese tube and you have a warranty issue, who do you take it up with? The eBay vendor that you bought it from or the Chinese factory?
Right.
That's a problem.
Right, yeah.
And until that kind of has more full resolution, whereas in the US, if you have a problem with a JJ tube, you take it up with Tube Depot or Antique Electronics Supply or Sovtech or Golden Lion, whoever the new sensor who's doing distribution, because they underwrite it. They have a distribution agreement and they backstop things in a very reliable way that the guitar industry and the hi-fi industry has been able to depend on. And I don't see that yet in the Chinese tube manufacturing industry. And so I wasn't willing to build a tube amp around a tube that was sourced from a Chinese supplier. And so with Western Electric coming back online with a 300B, it was like, no, if I'm going to build a flagship amplifier, it's going to have an American tube made on American soil by a vendor who will backstop themselves in truth. And I have reports that like some Western Electrics, there's been one or two that had like some wonky things go bad. All things mechanical can happen, but Western Electric has proven that they stand by their product, which is serialized and has 5-year unlimited use warranties, and they replace them. And that kind of backstopping is super, super important. These tubes are not cheap, but that warranty makes them 100% worth it, unquestionably worth it. And so the Takasuki, amazing tube, sounds amazing. The Elerog, amazing tube. I've heard it, sounds fantastic. The Western Electric, amazing tube. Which one sounds better? I don't care, does not matter to me. I think they all sound within 3 to 8% good, depending on what you're looking for. Enough, one standard deviation out, doesn't matter. But I think that all three are unquestionably good, reliable vendors, and thus worthy of use. I get asked, Justin, well, like your Bryce amp, super cool. You can do 15 watts. You build bigger transformers. Why don't you do 25 watts with an 845? I could. Who produces an 845 right now? Who produces a 211? There's only one country that's producing a 211 or an 845 in current production. What happens when there's 1,000 volts on the plate and it goes bad? Who's backstopping that tube?
This is a really big issue because some other, companies in the space have actually shifted their designs around this very idea of supply issues. We've been making this amp for whatever years. We're going to have to change it because what's going on with tube supply? You're bringing it in from a warranty perspective, and I totally understand that. People want reliability, but also just availability in general has been called into question, especially with some of the economic situations going on with Russia and the Ukraine and how that's affected the stream of supply as well. Now, from all intents and purposes, it does appear that there's a large supply of inventory from people who have stockpiled this over the years on U.S. soil too, but still, it's on top of mind for a lot of manufacturers, not just yourself. Yeah.
What I did, and I'm tiny, tiny. But what I did, I think, is indicative of what most of my colleagues did, which is we bought what all of our working capital would allow us to buy. So I bought like $10,000 worth of tubes in one night.
This was your reaction to the war in Ukraine?
And I also have like $200,000 worth of transformers in a warehouse. No, this is China with COVID shutting down, with China shutting down, with Europe shutting down, with you can't get a boat anywhere, with the world coming to an end. If you can't get a part, if you talk to anybody who had to buy anything, everybody went around the world and just made a decision that if I needed a part in the next 2 years, I was going to buy it and hold on to it. And so, like, whether there was conflict or need, everybody just bought everything we could and held on to it. And so, like my own transformer winder, I probably actually put him into early retirement. Like, truthfully, them's the shakes. But everybody turned around, like, so the war in Ukraine issue specifically, as an example, because the same thing to be said for, like, capacitors. Capacitors are, like, really hard to get. Really, really hard to get, like, different sizes and special capacitors and stuff like that. But, like, the war in Ukraine forced everybody who saw it coming to execute purchase agreements to buy all inventory that they could, and we depleted all available inventory out of all known suppliers so that the end consumer could not purchase anything for 60 to 90 days. What ended up happening then was you can buy from JJ because JJ is not Russia. So JJ Tubes is an uninterrupted tube source, and JJ actually makes fantastically good tubes. Truthfully, like, anybody who has any quibble with JJ Tubes should dispel that. They make very, very, very reliable, very, very, very good sounding tubes. Probably the best mass-produced KT88 currently on market is actually a JJ. You can buy almost every new sensor product that exists, meaning Golden Lions and whatnot, Sovtex, that are Russian products. But what happened is Russia froze all of those from us and said, we're not, because of the war and because we're being penalized for different kinds of embargoes, the world gets no tubes, haha, go play in the sand. And then they thought better of it. And they said, no, we will let you export, but there's now a 35% price hike. It's been fun. So everybody is still buying these tubes, but all of us at the wholesale level and at the consumer level are paying 35% more now for new sensor products, which is less fun. That makes no one happy.
One of the things that's often talked about in amplifiers is the idea of the amount of distortion in the chain. I think most people would agree, all tube analog amplifiers generally just kind of have a little bit more distortion in the line. But my question for you is, what is the true overall impact of that idea? How does it affect the sound? And do certain distortions actually make the sound better?
Yes, they do. I'm in the business of producing distortion. But my distortion sounds closer to the approximation of nature than that which is produced by solid-state devices in the amplification process. So as I amplify sound, I make it sound more real, more lifelike, nature-like than solid-state devices do, and thus more pleasing to our ears. But let's not mince words. It is distortion. Okay. It's also salt and fat when you eat food.
That's the flavor, right? That's where the flavor's at.
Doesn't mean you don't want to eat it. I mean, no one's getting nutrition through IV bags yet. What's the right mix? I mean, I still come from a place that believes in slow technology. So though I have an Apple Watch and I have 2 monitors in front of me and unfortunately 2 computers and 3 phones, God bless, I like my amplification and speakers and turntables to be understandable and accessible and predictable. And in so doing, the coloration that they provide is in a way that I can digest. I sometimes feel like a lack of distortion is its own problem, truthfully. So I've seen some amplifiers that are really, and speaker systems, if you think 2022, there were some amplification designs by very smart, very, very, very smart people who came out with amplification and speaker cone designs that were really cutting edge and remarkable and low distortion. And when people listened to it, they were able to say that they peered into the music and heard more information perhaps. But many of them, I think, also remarked that they heard less life or humanity from the music. It was not as engaging. So where do I stand on it? I stand on the side of musicality and engagement, not technicality. I'm moving with my 2-channel gear to a place of wanting more resolution and lower distortion. I see that there's a place for both. So on one hand, I'm low power and give me a tenoi, right? Give me a low power amp and a single tenoi and a big cabinet and call me a happy cat. Or I have a 604. Give me my 300B amp and my Altec 604 and I'm super, super happy. Or I have a JBL 4349. Super, super happy. Great, great fun. And then on the other hand, I have my Zions, which are super, super, super low distortion, and I want it with the highest resolution speaker I can, because the Zion is so low in distortion as a speaker, which is sort of counter to my house sound, that I can hear things in the recording that are not about musicality, but are details that I hadn't heard before. It's a different hearing experience. They both have merit. I'm not saying I'm right. Whichever one makes you happy is the one you should pursue. They're both different ideas. I think that all too often we promote one in the absence of the other. I think all too often there are people who think that you can have your cake and you eat it too. I think that that's also a lie. I think that you got to pick a side or pick a team. There's the guys that if you have an LS35A and 20-watt tube amp, that's a complete answer. Just like if you have a 100-watt Class A Hypex module amp and some Magnepans, that's a complete answer. They're both very different, very complete answers, but they're different. Let's not conflate the idea that one's strengths can be shared by the other. I don't always think that's true. On one hand, I'm trying to build amplifiers at my highest end, for 2-channel, that are really, really low distortion and just enough power to power modern high resolution speakers. But then on the other side of it, I like low power, high musicality, wide bandwidth amplifiers that are all about musicality and simplicity. And I think that there's a place for both. And one is going to have more distortion, for sure, but it's going to have more harmonic texture. The other one's going to have lower distortion and perhaps lower harmonic texture, but maybe even wider bandwidth. And so you have to have a driver that's pushing past 20K to a driver that's able to push, that's going lower than 20K and is going higher than 20K. I have an amplifier that goes 3 hertz to 100,000 kilohertz. I need a speaker that can do something similar. For my 5-watt amplifier or 8-watt amplifier that's doing 12 hertz to 30 kilohertz, it's a lot of distortion, a lot of harmonic texture. That's not what that doesn't need. It doesn't need a speaker that's super bandwidth. It needs a speaker that's meaty mid-range texture monster. And so that's system synergy choice, where you want things to be. Some people are all about harmonic texture and distortion and emotive feeling of the music, and some people want detail. I don't think people want all of it all the time.
It's very insightful. On my last question, number 5 on the list, we talked about this briefly, but I want to reiterate negative feedback in tube amplifier design. Can you kind of explain, I know you had mentioned it, but can you kind of explain what it is exactly and how it can be used efficiently and how some people might want to look out for it in certain types of designs or whatever. How can it be used wrongly? Because it is an interesting lever, I think, that amplifiers designers have to pull. But when do you pull that cord and when do you not need to do that?
With modern amplifiers, they have interesting tricks that they're now playing, which is what's called nested feedback. So they have certain circuits that they have extra feedback just in a certain part of the amplifier. Feedback makes the amplifier better behaved.
Can you tell me what it is? What exactly is feeding back in the system?
So it's taking the input signal and feeding it back, or the output signal and feeding it back into the input signal. And so the question becomes, is it useful? Yes, of course it can be useful. So typically when it does that, you need more input signal drive function from the input. In so doing, the sensitivity of the amplifier goes down typically. No big deal. It depends on depends on how sensitive the amplifier is inherently. It tends to make the amplifier more linear. I tend to think though that it makes the amplifier more homogeneous, so it will remove a little bit of its life from it. So if you heard an amplifier that's zero feedback versus an amplifier that has some feedback or a lot of feedback, if you heard all three settings, zero, moderate feedback, and excessive feedback, if you heard excessive feedback, you're like, wow, it's really flat. It's so, I can hear everything, but nothing really stands out. Versus if you heard no feedback, you'd be like, oh my God, all these little cues, but it's a little uneven. And then the moderate, you'd be sort of like, oh, maybe that's just the middle ground I like the most. It's a tricky thing because where do you slice the pie? Where do you find that right answer? I tend to want to hear as much of the source be outputted correctly as I can. And if it's an uneven recording, I want it to be an uneven playback. I don't need the amplifier to sort of improve the playback, improve the source for me. I want it to try to represent the source as best it can. Sometimes it's going to be a little off. I mean, we've all heard recordings that we wish sounded better. I don't always need them to sound better, though. I just kind of sometimes need them to sound off. Because when we hear the good recordings, then the good recordings do sound right.
Is it the role of the amplifier to just tell the truth of the situation? Or do you feel that at times, given the tube colorations and design challenges that you overcome, that it might be the job of the amplifier to make it sound better? What is the role of the amplifier in the chain?
I think the role of the amplifier is to tell it its truth, but its truth is already colored. Based on tube and transformer choice and circuit choice and capacitor choice, it's already colored. But it does its best job. Like, there are some companies that add circuits to change the frequency response of the amplifier, to maybe make it more bassy. That's not cool. Like, that's no fun. If a company has bought themselves a really inexpensive output transformer, they might add a circuit that accentuates a little bit of a bass frequency, because then it makes it sound like it's a more expensive amplifier. It's not done by a lot of American manufacturers, but it is done. It has existed in DIY fields for a long time. It exists in eBay stuff that comes to market, because the end result is it makes it sound better, but it's not truthful. I think that for most people, they want their amplifier to be truthful for whatever it is. Whether it's whatever they've bought, they want it to be the truth of that product to the best of its abilities. And that's sometimes why we own 2 or 3 amplifiers, because we recognize that that's that truth. Just like a CD player may have 2 different CD players used to have 2 different, very different sounds, right?
Yeah.
The output stage of 2 different CD players could have very fundamentally different sounds.
Oh, yeah.
And so sometimes that's why we had 2 different CD players side by side. Or the same thing to be said about two different cartridges. But you're like, but they're cartridges. It's like, yeah, I know. And they should sound the same, but they don't. And I accept that as a truth. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think most amp manufacturers don't try to change the sound. They try to convey the sound as honestly as they can. Now, what they deem as important about sound is obviously a product of, like, if they deem like air and spatial cues to be the most important thing, then they're going to make design decisions that support that. If they deem mid-range texture and harmonic composition to be the most important thing, then they're going to make design decisions that support that. So finding out like the theology of a company or the known general value set of the company is probably really important, because then you can understand, if you're buying, what you're supporting.
Justin, thank you so much for your time on the show today. I appreciate your I have to say on the closing here on the way out, I feel like you have a very interesting and fresh perspective on this. I've discussed the matter at length with many manufacturers, but I greatly appreciate your perspective into these things. And I like it in a way because it seems somewhat unique, but also in agreement with a lot of other smart minds in the industry. So thanks so much. Is there anything you want to kind of say at the out here? Any kind of thing you'd like to let our listeners know?
Always try to buy the best gear that you can with the idea that you're going to own it for 5 years. If you do not plan to buy that piece, truly, like you're not going to ever get to buy anything else for, like, if you're buying an amplifier, you're buying it for 5 years. Not that you have to, but that you should try to make your decisions based on, like, I want to own this for 5 years. You'll always make better decisions. Give yourself a little bit more time. Don't buy middle term decisions. Buy things that you think are longer term. You'll be happier for it.
I like that. Justin, thanks again for your time, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and Audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. The Occasional Podcast and its original associated music is monitored, mixed, and mastered on the Focal Trio 6 BE studio monitors. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.